All right, last week we finished up our study on Philip, looking at the apostles. We've covered the first seven. So now we're down to Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, and then the last four we mentioned in Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6 as well. And then we'll also talk about, I'll tack on at the end as well, we'll talk about, we are going to cover Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed Jesus. We're going to talk about Matthias. There's very little about Matthias, but we're going to talk about what there is. And then we'll talk about Paul as well, since Paul was an apostle born out of due time, as he refers to it. But we won't go into a whole lot of depth about Paul, given there's so much between Peter and Paul. Those are kind of the two main ones we have the most information about. And so we won't have a whole lot that we'll go into about Paul. All right, so talking about Bartholomew, we mentioned as we ended last week, that Bartholomew is mentioned as Bartholomew in the lists of the apostles in Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1. And it would seem to be, not necessarily that the way they're put in the lists imply any connection necessarily, although in some cases it is. You've got Peter, and then who's right after Peter? Andrew. And was there a connection between Peter and Andrew? Yeah, they were brothers. And Andrew was the one that told Peter about Jesus. And then you've got James and John. What's the connection between them? They are brothers, the sons of Zebedee. So the fact that you do have Bartholomew, you have Philip, and then Bartholomew, again, it's not conclusive that there's a connection there, but the fact that we do see Philip going in John chapter 1 and in John chapter 21 to Nathanael, telling him about the Messiah, just as Andrew did with Philip, suggests that what we're talking about when we talk about Bartholomew and Nathanael, we're talking about the same person. Again, we have multiple examples of individuals in the Old Testament who were known both by their Jewish or Hebrew name as well as their Greek or Roman name. And often they had both names at the same time, like John Mark. Okay, both names were incorporated together. And so understanding then that possibility exists, then it's possible we're talking about Bartholomew and Nathanael as being the same exact type of thing. We see Nathanael in John 1 and in verse 45, and we talked a little bit about the fact that when Jesus speaks to Nathanael here, remember, Philip, he goes just as Andrew went after seeing John call out the fact that this is Jesus, the Son of God, or the Lamb of God. Andrew goes and tells Peter. Well, Philip, he goes and tells Nathanael. And Nathanael says in verse 46, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip says, "Come and see." And so Jesus sees Nathanael coming in verse 47, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." The fact that, first of all, Nathanael is named, to me, is important as well. If this were somebody that the brethren would know nothing about or wouldn't have any reason to know specifically his name, then I don't know that John would have necessarily included his name in it. But the fact that Nathanael is mentioned and the fact that Jesus makes this statement about an Israelite in whom is no deceit says something about, first of all, Nathanael, but we'll get there in a minute. So then in verse 48, Nathanael says, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered and said to him, "Behold, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answered and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel." Now, the fact that whatever it was that Jesus is referring to, Jesus is implying an understanding about something regarding Nathanael being under a fig tree. That knowledge is what convinces Nathanael to say, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you're the King of Israel." So whatever it is that Jesus is referring to, that Jesus doesn't explain, but only he and Nathanael apparently know about it, that suggests to Nathanael that this is miraculous. Okay, this is divine power of God that he would know this. Now, whether Nathanael was actually sitting under a fig tree when Philip had come to him to talk to him, and maybe it was during that event before Philip got there that Nathanael was maybe saying a prayer or something under a fig tree, or maybe Jesus is referring to an event some days or weeks before this. maybe he's praying, help me to find the Messiah. Maybe he's praying, help me to see the Lamb of God, or whatever. Maybe it's not even a prayer. I don't know. Maybe it's something else. But whatever it is that this event is referring to, it's enough to convince Nathanael this man has to be from God. This is miraculous or divine knowledge. There's no way he could possibly know this unless he was sent from God. And so to me, and like I said, there's a couple commentaries that suggest that this was some sort of a phrase, and that rabbis would call upon it to say, I have information to give you, or something along that line, and you need to follow me. I don't think that's it at all. I don't think that has any water, because Nathanael's response is a complete observation of the power of the Lord. So whatever this was, I believe it was a literal event. Something happened under a fig tree with Nathanael being the only one there. I tend to think it was probably a prayer that God heard, and Jesus is in essence, and I'm speculating, that Jesus is in essence saying, God is answering your prayer, here I am. Again, nobody else would have been there, so nobody would have known. And not to mention the fact that, can you pray in your mind without saying it out loud? Sure, yeah, you can. So even if somebody else had been there, if Nathanael wasn't speaking out loud, nobody would have known it anyway. But regardless, Nathanael answers here in verse 49, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. Now it's interesting that John, at no point does he refer to Bartholomew. Okay, we have the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, referring to, and then Luke again in Acts, referring to Bartholomew, but they never reference Nathanael. They never ever use Nathanael's name. John never references Bartholomew, but he references Nathanael. So again, I think it's a difference of audience and who the audience would have recognized regarding which name was being used, whether it was Bartholomew, which would have been his Hebrew name, or Nathanael being his Greek or Roman name. And I know it sounds weird because Nathanael seems to be linked to Nathan, but if I recall correctly, Nathanael's actually has a Greek root to it. So that could be the situation. But in verse 50, Jesus answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And again, I believe that speaks to a literal event that Jesus is referring to, showing a measure of power to Nathanael, but there's going to be even something greater you're going to see than that. You think that's the power of God? Well, you're going to see some other things that's going to be even greater. And so Jesus said, he said to him, most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Now, it's interesting that Nathanael is being specifically spoken to here. Again, that would I tend to think that because John names him, and because there's very specific dialogue between Jesus and Nathanael, that does speak to Nathanael being the same as Bartholomew being an apostle. I tend to think that that's the most likely reason why John would include this in the first place, to kind of show that authority of apostleship, to maybe even because in the 90s AD, Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already been written, Acts had already been written, and the fact that maybe they didn't record a lot of details about Bartholomew. In fact, Nathanael's not the only one he records details on that the other Gospels don't. So maybe John is incorporating some details to kind of give some background on some of these apostles that really aren't referenced a lot in some of the other Gospels. But regardless, verse 51, what do you think Jesus is referring to when he says, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man? What do you think that's all about? Is there an event where that would have taken place? Okay, well, there's the Mount of Transfiguration, which certainly has that same kind of the gloriousness of, or the glory of Jesus being displayed. But as far as we know, there were only 3 apostles present for that one. Who were they? Peter, James, and John. Now, that's not to say that the other apostles maybe were further down the mountain. Maybe they saw some of that. That's possible. But I don't know that specifically the Mount of Transfiguration doesn't refer to anything about angels ascending and descending. So what else could it be? Remember, and I heard it whispered just a second ago, there is an Old Testament reference that comes to mind when you read this. What is it? Jacob's ladder. Okay, remember the dream, the vision that Jacob was given when he slept on the rock, he took a rock as his pillow and he was asleep, and in his dream he sees a ladder reaching into heaven with angels of God descending and ascending on it. Okay, and when Jacob woke up, what did he do? He built an altar. Okay, he built an altar at that spot. And it is interesting that Jesus references something that would easily take you back to that idea or that concept of Jacob's ladder. And what lesson, at least, do we gain from what Jacob's vision was? What kind of do we see? What do we take away from that vision? In fact, I mean, for a lot of reasons, what purpose was it even given to Jacob to start with? Why do you think God bothered giving Jacob that vision to start with? What does that imply? The fact that you've got a ladder reaching into heaven with angels going up and down. Yeah. And I think in general it has to do with the fact that God is working here to the extent that he has power and ability to reach the earth, okay? But using all the means at his disposal, he has angels wandering around all the time. What they're doing, what they're involved in, I can't tell you that. I don't know. That's within God's realm. But even so, as far back as Jacob, what Jacob took from that was the understanding that God is in control, that God's presence is all around. Of course, he built a physical altar there, but it wasn't that is exactly where that ladder exists. Okay, it was kind of a metaphorical, symbolic thing to show that God's constantly in charge. He has constant power on earth. Now, whether or not Jesus is using this as a callback, if you will, to show that God, through me, is working on the earth, and through me, thus, verse 50, you will see greater things than these. Okay, it could very well be a sense in which Jesus is referring to the power of God being performed through Jesus, the power of the Father through Jesus, to show his being the Son of God. And so that verse 50 and verse 51 would then be connected, because then he says, you will see greater things than these, and then an immediate reference to Jacob's ladder, showing that constant power of God and that constant relationship, or that constant working of God taking place. Okay, that's one possibility. The other possibility is that it is a literal event, either that's not recorded, okay, that maybe was only for Nathanael. I don't know why that would be. Maybe all the apostles were witness to it. It's possible that, for instance, at the ascension, okay, all the apostles were there at the ascension. Even though angels aren't specifically mentioned there, we do have some individuals in white array who are standing there with the apostles. And, the apostles, their jaws are open. They're looking in the sky, and they're like, what is, this is amazing. And the angels are saying, what? Why are you looking up in the sky, marveling? In the same way that Jesus left, the same way will he return. Okay, so we know there were, and even though they weren't called angels, we know that they were angels. There were angels present at the ascension, but there's no reference to them ascending or descending upon the Son of Man necessarily. In terms of Jesus himself receiving angels, we know that took place in Matthew chapter 4. We know it took place in the Garden of Gethsemane. So in Matthew chapter 4, in the wilderness, after he was tempted by Satan, he received angels that ministered to him. After he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, angels came and ministered to him. But an actual event in which angels were ascending and descending upon him, there's not specifically recorded about that. So either we're talking about something that is figurative, representing the power of God that's going to be done through Jesus, or we're talking about an event that was not recorded, or at least the details of these specifics were not recorded with the event. Thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
So it could very well have been something of that sort that
Was allowed to see. Could be.
But back to kind of the earlier part of this, verse 15 says, because I said to you, I saw you in a fig tree, do you believe? To me, this is part of the context. A couple of verses just before that explains what happened. Jesus, having never met him before, knows who this is under this tree.
Yeah.
That's the power of the Son of God, because he knows everything by name.
Yep.
To me, that this is a simple explanation within the context of what has just happened, that Nathanael could understand, hey, this guy that I've never met just said, before Philip came over and talked to you, I saw you over there. I knew who you were.
Yeah.
And he asked him, how do you know me? I mean, so he understood that Jesus knew who he was.
Yeah.
That, to me, is fitting with the context of
Sure.
that Jesus was able to do that. And then in verse 51, did this impress you?
Yeah.
You're going to
See even more.
far greater than that, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And it could also be, again, figurative, but the sense of the angels ascending and descending simply being a reference to the power of God being done through me. Okay, the fact, I mean, all the things the apostles saw, the feeding of the multitudes, the rising of people from the dead, particularly, I mean, in particular, Lazarus certainly was perhaps the most high-profile one, or the most widely spread one. The healing of lepers, the healing of the lame, the healing of the blind, the healing of the mute, and so forth. All of these individuals who are casting out demons, all of those things are going to show the power of God in Christ Jesus. And so whether Jesus is referring to just kind of the body of work that's going to be shown to Nathanael or not, certainly I believe that it certainly is a reference to, connected to verse 50, the power of God. You think that's something, just wait and see what else God can do. Yes, sir.
Just one quick comment. Jesus does say, I could have called 10,000 angels down.
That's true.
At any point in time, at my bidding, to take care of this, if I had so chosen. So,
Yeah.
again, it's just the power that he has.
Yeah, that's true.
As God on earth, the Son of Man.
Right.
Interesting that phrase is used at the end, Son of Man.
Descending on the Son of Man.
But yet, he knew who Nathanael was.
Right. Power of God. Right, and that's you are the Son of God, the King of Israel, and then Jesus himself references the Son of Man. So yeah, it is interesting. All right, anything else through this event with Nathanael? Okay, so the other event that we have specifically recorded regarding Nathanael is in John chapter 21 and in verse 2, and that's simply, he's one of the 7 who's there at the Sea of Tiberias along with Peter and Andrew, James and John, and there were 3 others, or Nathanael, and then I think there were 2 others. Andrew may not be mentioned there. Let me make sure. John 21. Simon, Peter, Thomas. Okay, it was Thomas that I was thinking of. Simon, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and 2 others. So Andrew's not mentioned there. It was Thomas. They are mentioned here at the Sea of Tiberias. So it's not all of the apostles together. But this is after Jesus has been raised from the dead, and whether this speaks to Nathanael's trade being that one of fishing or not, we know that Peter was a fisherman. We know James and John were fishermen. The fact that 2 others aren't specifically named doesn't necessarily mean they weren't apostles, but it's possible that they weren't. Maybe they were just friends or other disciples or whatever. Well, it says the disciples to the Sea of Tiberias. So it does sound like they were disciples, may not have been apostles. But regardless, he's kind of just mentioned, not really in passing, but as a part of this group here in verse 2. Now, that being the case, the fact that John doesn't mention Bartholomew, but does connect Philip to Nathanael, and the fact that Nathanael's the one that questioned if anything good could come out of Nazareth, I think is interesting. And so the fact that you have Bartholomew be having a Hebrew root to it, Nathanael, even though Nathanael sounds like Nathan, has a Greek or a Roman or Greek origin or root to it, suggests that these are the same person. Both Jerome and Eusebius, granted these are hundreds of years after the fact, they both link Bartholomew to teaching in India, eventually being skinned alive in Armenia in 69 AD. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture depicting Nathanael or Bartholomew. It's actually really graphic. In all of the pictures, either he's holding a skinning knife or he's holding his skin in his hands. It's really graphic. And I had seen pictures of that before. I had no idea what it was about until I started studying about what the legends were about Bartholomew, and that's why that's there. Is because of that. Whether or not that actually happened, okay, again, that's part of legend, not part of the scriptures. Is it outside the realm of possibility that something like that could have happened? The Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 11, in the latter half of the chapter, he goes, time would fail me to talk of so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And then in that list of things, of things that people went through, what did some faithful people have to go through? They were sawn in two. Okay? So being skinned alive is not outside the realm of possibility here. And if indeed that is the fact, I mean, there's a lot of ways you wouldn't want to die, but if indeed Nathanael or Bartholomew did die that way, certainly holding fast to the faith, holding fast to the gospel, that's just one more example of a faithful servant of God willing to go through not just, we talk about death, okay? That's not just death. That's torture and death. All right? It's not, boom, boom, you're dead. This probably was very torturous. And many of the saints went through torture. Okay, we talk about not just with Nero, but later with Domitian, we have Christians being used as torches in Rome. Their bodies, they were lit alive in cages to be torched, to provide light in Rome. So, this is not unique in terms of the brutality that saints had to deal with, if that in fact did happen. Thoughts or comments through Bartholomew? What about characteristics of Bartholomew? There's not really anything here that we could go on that would give us any insight necessarily into negative qualities or characteristics. And I don't know that there's really anything you can take away from his statement about can anything good come out of Nazareth. Some speculate that he was being, racist isn't the right term, ethnicist, I don't know what you would call that. That he was biased somehow against people from Nazareth. But that's just one statement. Maybe it was just kind of a common thought process that people from Nazareth just didn't really, maybe they were just very poor, so they never really did much. I don't know. Okay, I wouldn't say though that was somehow bias against people from Nazareth. So I don't think really you'd make that extrapolation. But what good things do we see from Nathanael? Things that we should emulate. There's no deceit found in this man. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute and just how profound a statement that is. Okay? If you look hard enough, deceit can be found in almost anybody most of the time. Now, what does deceit mean? Trying to fool people. Okay? Now, how might that be applied, especially in a religious way, or connected to, in some way, religious ways? What did the Pharisees often do? Which Jesus called them out and called them hypocrites for. Outwardly, they appeared holy and righteous, but inwardly, what were they full of? Dead men's bones. Okay. They put on a show to make themselves look like they were holy and righteous, but inwardly they had no righteousness, and they had, not necessarily that they didn't have a desire to be, but they had convinced themselves that they were by their own works. And by looking holy, that means I am holy. And a lot of times, even with religious people, either they can deceive themselves or they can try to deceive others and making people think that they're better than what they are. They can put on a holy mask, but inside they're defiled and unholy. Okay, that's just from a religious perspective. And then you add to that certainly the way in which people deceive others in life in general. Okay, ultimately deceit is a selfish characteristic. It's about what I want people to think contrary to what exists or what is. And it's always used in a selfish way, trying to gain advantage, trying to gain, in some way, influence, trying to put my best fake example forward. And yet, Jesus says no deceit was found in Nathanael. Which says that Nathanael, what would be the opposite of deceit then? Pure, sincere, okay, without guile. The idea that this man was real. Okay, he was honest with himself. Again, the fact that he has no deceit, I would suggest that counts not only towards others but towards himself as well. He was honest with himself. Doesn't mean he was perfect. That's not what that means. It does mean, though, he didn't shy away from acknowledging his faults. Didn't shy away from the fact that he wasn't perfect. He didn't try to fool people and put on a good face or try to put on a mask of some sort. He was what he was. When you talked to him, when you saw him, that's who he was. Okay? And I'm sure we've all met people at work or at school or other places where you meet them and you just get this feeling, either because this person's too enthusiastic or there's something about their smile that it's just fake. There's something about it that just isn't sincere or real. There's a phrase we use sometimes. What do we call them? Huh? Well, sometimes we call people who kind of have that fake exterior. Sometimes a used car salesman, snake oil salesman, slimy, okay? Politician, okay? Hypocrite. All right, those are the types of people, but you kind of get a sixth sense sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you can get this feeling that something's not right about this person. They're not genuine. And
this is a word, but I think of jealousy also, because they're jealous of someone that they probably need to be like.
In order to protect their own.
They're not one, but they're being deceitful because
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. And certainly it would suggest that they feel that their genuine selves isn't good enough or isn't enough to convince people, whatever, and so they have to put on a face. Yeah, so that certainly could speak to that as well. But whatever when you talk about deceit and all the different ways that applies, that wasn't Nathanael. Nathanael was real and genuine, and I think that speaks a lot about his character. And it's when you talk about somebody who is genuine, even if at times they say things not wrong or sinful, but just say things maybe that are blunt or straightforward about themselves or about a situation or whatever, sometimes it maybe can be a put-off for some people. But for a lot of us, we would much prefer having someone genuine and honest than all the fake and deceitful things that we find in our society. And I would tend to say some of our best friends are probably people who are genuine and honest. We appreciate that. At least qualities in Christians generally appreciate similar qualities of genuine honesty. All right, what else about Nathanael?
I found just a brief passing note about Nazareth
Mm-hmm.
that says it's a rather obscure town nowhere mentioned in the Old Testament. So when Philip says, "We found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote," and he says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" He may have been thinking that seems unlikely since we've never read about this.
That could be.
Town. So maybe it wasn't a derogatory or even sarcasm. Maybe he was really kind
Can
of
anything literally good,
yeah.
like in fulfillment of the prophecies? Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that
So I had never thought about Nazareth not ever being mentioned.
in the Old Testament. That's an interesting point, and it could be. And if that's the case, you could certainly extrapolate the fact that he had an understanding of the prophecies. If that's kind of how he's using this, is Nazareth mentioned in any prophecies? We know that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, not that he would come out of Nazareth.
He says, "Come and see and check it out."
Come and see. Let's find out. Let's go. Let him. Why don't you talk to him and find out? And so that is a good thought. That's an interesting thought. I hadn't considered that. Yeah. All right. Anything else? And of course, and again, we don't know for sure exactly what happened to Nathanael, but as far as we can tell, all of the apostles, save for John, were killed for the cause of Christ. Whether or not he really was killed in Armenia, as has been recorded again, this is 300 years after the fact, 400 years after the fact, may or may not have, but I tend to think it's probably a safe assumption he was killed for the cause of Christ. And as with all of the apostles who were willing to face death and die, they're basing it on what they saw. Okay, they were eyewitnesses. They were there. They saw these things happen. They touched the Lord. Just as John refers to how we saw this and we touched him and we know that this is real. We know that this happened. The fact that they were willing to stand their ground in their eyewitness testimony and stick to it even to the point of death also speaks to their sincerity, their genuineness of faith, their conviction. And certainly I think you could say that about Bartholomew/Nathanael as well. Anything else on Bartholomew-Nathanael? All right, let's move on to Thomas. Thomas is one of those interesting ones that we have very little mentioned about, although Thomas is probably one of the more well-known, simply based on the event after Jesus was raised from the dead, the event where we refer to Thomas as Doubting Thomas. But Thomas, the term Thomas, actually literally means twin. It's not just Thomas the twin, it's the twin. And I think that's kind of interesting because he's Thomas known as the twin, or the twin known as Thomas. As the name Thomas means twin, who his twin was is unknown. Just because he's listed here along with Matthew does not mean that Thomas and Matthew necessarily were brothers. There is nothing in the text that suggests, usually, at least with the example of Philip and Andrew and James and John, we know they were brothers because the scriptures specify they were brothers. Okay? As it pertains to this particular instance, it doesn't sound that Thomas and Matthew are connected, at least in terms of being brothers, just because their names are back to back in the text. Now, that could be wrong. Okay, it could be that he was also a brother of Matthew, but as we're going to cover when we cover Matthew, there was also another brother of Matthew that is mentioned in Scripture, which we'll talk about later. But aside from being listed among the apostles in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and again in Acts chapter 1, John is the only gospel that records any details about Thomas. And again, the fact that we have so many examples of this, where there's at least one detailed event or dialogue or something, makes me wonder if John, again, writing after Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts had already been written, already been dispersed, okay, he's writing these things, maybe there just wasn't a lot of detailed events recorded about people like Nathanael or Philip. And so maybe in his gospel, as he's recording the accounts that he thinks are necessary to show the humanity of Jesus, remember that's part of his purpose, is to show that he was flesh and blood, that in doing so he includes or incorporates certain details about some of these apostles that weren't recorded in the other gospels. But John's the only one that records any details about Thomas. We see in John chapter 11 that Thomas was actually prepared to die with Jesus. And actually, this is kind of an interesting and almost somewhat obscure event, because what we have is we have Lazarus dying here in verse 5 and 6. Remember, he's told that Lazarus is sick. Then he waits, and Lazarus then dies. And then in verse 7, after this he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." And the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to stone you, and you're going there again." Now, Jesus is wanting to go to Bethany. Bethany's not far from Jerusalem. Okay? And this is part of the reason why, when Lazarus was raised from the dead, it was such an event. Because it wasn't like Bethany's out there in the middle of nowhere. It's very close to Jerusalem. So people are talking about it, and it's going through Jerusalem. And in fact, that event is what ultimately leads to the Jews really, the Sanhedrin really kind of kicking it in gear to capture Jesus. Not only did they want to capture and kill Jesus, who else did they want to kill? Lazarus. They wanted to get rid of the evidence, okay? Because it had been widely reported that Lazarus had been dead for 3 days. That's why Jesus waited. So that it would be obvious, not like he was accidentally put in the tomb, but he was still alive, and Jesus just, made it out like he raised him from the dead. No, he was dead, and one of the sisters even points out He's stinking at this point. Jesus raised him from the dead. And so that was widely reported. But the fact of the matter was, it was dangerous because even at this point, the Jews are still trying to get to him. Okay, they sought to stone him last time he went, and the apostles are like, they tried to stone you last time. Why would you go back? Verse 9, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. What does Jesus mean by that? You only have so much time to get done what you need to do during the day. And Jesus knows his time is coming, but is his day almost up? I mean, his day is almost up, but is it up yet? No. And so he has to get in the things he wants to get done before that time ends. While there's still light, there's still work to be done. And so in verse 11, these things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. Another example of the disciples having a difficulty getting over that whole physical, spiritual thing. Often in the scriptures, death is referred to as sleep. Why is that? What's the purpose of referring to it as sleep? Paul refers to it as sleeping in 1 Corinthians 15. What does it show? What does it emphasize? Sorry? Okay. Yeah, it kind of emphasizes that power of the Lord, that just as you would shake someone awake from sleep, the Lord can easily shake somebody awake from the dead. Okay, it emphasizes that aspect. The disciples didn't understand. It's not like this was a common saying. Okay, the disciples didn't understand it. They thought he was literally asleep. And Jesus instead is referring to him being dead, but that's nothing to the Lord. Okay, being dead is nothing. God can raise him from the dead. It's not a problem. But Jesus spoke of his death, talking about not his own death, but Lazarus' death. But they thought he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Jesus said to them plainly, Jesus has to come out and say it. Again, remember we talked before about the disciples, and not necessarily, it's understandable that they had a hard time getting over that whole spiritual, physical thought process. Everything they heard, they interpreted physically, and in that process, literally physically, not in the spiritual way in which it was being told. So Jesus had to come right out and say, Lazarus is dead, and I'm glad for your sakes I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. I'm glad for your sakes I wasn't there, because it makes it sound as though, and of course we know this is going to lead to the shortest, quote-unquote, shortest verse in the Bible, which is Jesus wept. Okay? And it makes it sound as though if Jesus had been there, Jesus may have felt compelled to heal him rather than let him die. But Jesus says, I'm glad we weren't there for your sakes. Okay, so that 3 days later, here he is dead. Now Jesus can show by the power of God raising him from the dead, and they can understand what that sleep means. That sleep is nothing. Okay, dying, death is nothing to God. Therefore, sleep, death, it's no different. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up what Thomas says in verse 16 next week, and we'll also have the notes on Sunday for our last four listed, at least in these contexts of the next four apostles, and we'll also have Matthias and Paul. Thank you, everybody.